Jazzcast Pros.
When did you officially call yourself an entrepreneur? Have you yet to call yourself an entrepreneur? My podcast producer, Jazzy, and I have gone back and forth a lot about the use of that word specifically in my intro, in my marketing, and how I talk about the podcast, because there's a lot of people out there who are entrepreneurs but don't necessarily resonate with that title quite yet. And I think a lot of my content speaks to the people who maybe aren't quite there yet. And so when I say for the entrepreneur, and if you're like, well, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm selling things or I'm growing a business or building a community or, creating content, but I don't get paid to do it. I haven't replaced my income with it yet. I haven't achieved some sort of milestone quite yet, then they don't necessarily resonate with that identity. The idea of this episode is that words can change everything. Welcome to High Vibe Table Talks, the podcast to help you, the cautiously ambitious woman, remove mental barriers and take action now so that you can achieve your high vibe desires. I'm Rashawn, your high vibe curator, cheerleader, and accountability partner. As a wife, a mother, and an entrepreneur who recently quit my job to follow my dreams, I understand why you may be hesitant to throw caution to the wind and take that leap. Someone I met early on in my kind of entrepreneur, manifesting, universe, spiritual journey was this man called Mike Dooley, and his philosophy is that thoughts become things. It's the idea of manifestation, but what really kicks off manifestation is your thoughts, and that is where you control your destiny. In Rayanne's episode, we talk about where your thoughts, where your mindset is right now versus where you would like your mindset, where you'd like your thoughts to be. For instance, I struggle with calling myself a sales expert or someone who sells sales courses because I don't consistently sell out my mastermind. And so going from the mindset of wow, I really struggle with sales to I have a funnel that I pour into on a weekly basis and I create sales content that is impactful to people. And that doesn't happen overnight. That's not this switch that you just flip and all of a sudden it's I've been cured. I no longer think that way. That's not how it works. And it takes time. It takes intention. It takes really understanding where your mindset is, where you want it to go, and on a daily basis saying, these are the thoughts that I want to center myself in today. I took a writing course the fall of 2020 into the winter. One of the things that they were talking about is you're not just writing when you're writing. You're also writing when you're thinking about writing. And that can feel what? Huh? But writing a certain number of words every day doesn't make you a writer. Coming out with a weekly podcast every week for 1 year doesn't make you a podcaster. And that's the same thing with entrepreneurship. There's not this magical level that you reach where all of a sudden you're yep, I'm an entrepreneur. I hit 6 figures, and so now I'm an entrepreneur. Well, what were you when you made $999,999? It's not this switch that flips. It's not selling a certain amount. It's not replacing your income. There's so many variables that people use as goalposts of once I do this, then I will. And everybody starts from zero. Everybody fails. And that doesn't make them less of an entrepreneur. I really think that it's just starting. It's not May 2nd, I was not an entrepreneur, and now it's May 3rd, and I hit this, and so now I'm an entrepreneur. And therefore, I think that a lot of us are entrepreneurs before, especially the women that I work with, before we even say that we are or identify with that term. And I think part of it's because it's scary. What does being an entrepreneur actually mean? What is it? What shape does it take? Can I not be an entrepreneur if I like put it down for a second or have a bad month or need to take time off or put something out there that nobody buys? What I think to like the garden metaphor that I like to use a lot is a gardener only considered a gardener when they have acres where they produce tons of food? Is a writer only someone who gets paid to write or writes in the thousands of words every single day, or someone who every time they write, it's just brilliant? Is a runner only somebody who runs 50 miles a week or runs consistent sub 8-minute miles? What is someone who runs a 9-minute mile? Are they not a runner? It's complex and it's nuanced. And as I said before, like I've really struggled with this thought of being like a sales expert or someone who sells sales content or creates sales content when I necessarily haven't sold out my mastermind or still figuring out exactly what my funnel looks like. But I have a lot of knowledge around sales. And when I truly feel the most like a salesperson, it's not necessarily about the outcome, it's about the input. It's me showing up to my sales funnel on a consistent basis. So that's why I think that words are so important. And I'm not saying like go out and say, I'm an entrepreneur to everybody that you meet, especially early on in the process. It's important to say those words in safe spaces. You know, if you walk into a room of people who are making $1 million a year from their business or have sold companies or have hit a certain level of quote unquote success that they believe is success, you say, I'm an entrepreneur. And they're like, oh, what do you sell? What's your business? And you're still very early on and you stumble and they're like, ugh, you're not really an entrepreneur. Not that I'm saying that there's a ton of rooms like there, but there are places where, you know, oh, I'm a podcaster. Oh, what's your podcast? Well, I'm still in like ideation phase. Well, then you're not really a podcaster. And we've all been in rooms like that. And I think sometimes it is a projection of people who are scared to put themselves out there, who project their own fear of failure and struggle and desire to do something, but have never taken the action to do it. And they project that fear onto you of like, well, you're not really. Says who? It's like in Big Magic where Elizabeth Gilbert talks about how it all really matters and also nothing matters. Like, I do think that words truly are important, but like someone else's projection of the words that you use about yourself, like it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Like, why is someone else's definition of success or entrepreneur or podcaster or writer or runner or gardener or caretaker or home curator or whatever? Why am I taking that for what I should or shouldn't believe about myself? I'm not less of a homemaker because I don't mop every day, whatever. But there is a lot of vulnerability, especially in the beginning. And so speaking it into safe spaces that can hold space for you for those beliefs when they're not necessarily like completely hardwired into our being yet is important. As I was thinking about this topic, it really reminded me of this speech by Theodore Roosevelt. And I first heard about this speech from Brene Brown, who is an expert in vulnerability and entrepreneurship and vulnerability. Like, you cannot have one without the other. Like, I always talk about how entrepreneurship is such a journey of self-reflection and self-growth. And if you're not ready to do the work, you're not ready to be an entrepreneur. And vulnerability is so deeply entangled with it. So she talks about the speech, The Man in the Arena. I will put the link to her speech in the show notes. I never say to stop listening to my podcast and go do something else. But right now I would implore you to stop listening to this and go listen to her talk about it, because it is such a beautiful way of encapsulating this journey that we're on. And there are people who are like, you're doing a what as an entrepreneur? And it's like, what are you doing? What? Like the people who criticize me as an entrepreneur or a podcaster or a creative are never the ones that are in doing the work. They're the ones that are sitting on the sidelines being like, you suck, boo, and it's like, I'm not interested in taking criticism from you. Like, you're not in here getting beat up, falling, scraping your knees and bashing your head onto something. Like, you're not in here doing the work. So I have no interest in your feedback about something that you're not even doing. One of the reasons that I love the mastermind and running it in the way and curating it in the way that I have is because it's niche agnostic, because so much of the struggles that we go through are similar. So much of the imposter syndrome that we have a hard time with is similar, regardless of if we're selling dog treats or writing a book or creating a co-working space or creating a coaching business. And so while we don't always agree on what steps to take, like there's this level of I'm accepting what you're saying from the place of someone who is also like putting themselves out there to do it. And it's also so much easier to say someone else should do something and not necessarily do it for our own. So again, if you have not listened to Brene Brown's Man in the Arena speech or Theodore Roosevelt, if you have not read his speech, it's incredible, it's powerful, it's impactful, and it's so connected to what we're talking about today. For a long time, I had a really hard time calling myself a creative. And the reason, if I kind of dissect it, and I think this is why it held true for me for decades, this held true for me, is that I was not a creative. Because in the traditional sense, creatives are writers. They draw, they paint, they write poetry, they create movies, they are in theater, they sing, they're songwriters, they work with porcelain or whatever medium it is to create. And like there are specific mediums in which creatives are looked at in mainstream. I was not one of those. Like I cannot draw. For a long time, I had a big negative relationship with poetry. All of the traditional mediums in which people express their creativity was not me. And so I'm like, oh, I'm math and science brained. So you can't possibly be a creative that's using the other side of your brain. When I was in high school, I was actually staying after school for extra help in English. Like, we had practice after school, but you had time in between when school ended and practice started. And so as a freshman, like you can't go anywhere. So I wanted to get extra help in English because it was a subject that I was struggling with. And, if you asked me to walk into the school and go and sit down exactly where I was in the exact classroom that I did when this experience happened to me, I could do it now. And this is when I was 14 years old. So we're at 23 years later. And I looked at my teacher and I'm like, I just am having a hard time turning the thoughts I have in my brain into words that can go on the piece of paper. And she just looked at me and was like, aren't they words in your brain? And I felt so dismissed, and that like the only way that you can be a good writer or a good creative is if they have a form in your brain already, and then they just like have this magic that transcribes them into words on a page. Or like an artist is someone who like has this vision and then they just go up to the canvas and they just like do it. And my brain didn't work like that. So therefore I was not a creative. I was recently listening to a podcast called the Unpublished Podcast. And I really enjoy this podcast, especially when thinking about creativity and putting your creativity out into the world. And they were talking about how the one woman, she is not good at grammar or spelling. And so she always did very poorly in English, and people always look down upon her as a writer because she's not good at what is mainstream considered good writing, and that is spelling and grammar. And she was like, my first drafts look horrible, but the idea is there, and then we refine it, and there's a reason why there's editors, and there's a reason why there you have multiple drafts. And she has put out some really great books, and she's written some really, really bad drafts and created some really bad art. And that's where like the both come into play. And I think that it's powerful. And now I consider myself a creative because like I create conversations, I create safe and vulnerable spaces, and I create community, and I create connection. And those aren't mediums that are looked at when you're in school or typically in mainstream of like as a creative. More so now that we have like social media, and creating a community is something that is powerful and people will pay for and people see the impact of. But it took me a long time to really sit here and say, I am a creative. I like creating. And my version of creativity looks different than the black and white theory that I had for a long, long time. And it's one of the reasons why in the lightning round with all my guests, I asked them what creativity looks like to them. And I've never had someone answer that question the same way in any of them. And I've had tens and tens of guests up until this point. No one answers it the same way. And I think that's so beautiful, but was for a while hard for me to wrap my head around of like, this is what I think it is, and this is what it should look like. Therefore, I am not. Part of leaning into being the relaxed entrepreneur is leaning into the land of yes and. Can I have a full-time job and be an entrepreneur? Yes. Can I be an entrepreneur and not be bringing in a ton of money? Yes. Can I be an entrepreneur and not be bringing in any money? Yes. And like I say that while also believing that if you don't sell, you don't have a business, but just because you're not selling doesn't mean you can't have the mindset, the spirit, the activity of an entrepreneur. Can I be a writer and not write every day? Yes. Can I be a podcaster and not release my first podcast? Yes. I had the idea of podcasting for a year to 2 years before I did it. And so even in that ideation phase, and I recorded some, and even in that ideation phase, like I still think that I was a podcaster. I am those things because I show up to them on a consistent basis. Sometimes that consistent basis is daily. You know, right now I'm in the process where I pour into my sales funnel every single day. It doesn't always look the same. It doesn't always generate sales, but I pour into it every day. Sometimes it's weekly. You know, I pour into this podcast on a weekly basis. Sometimes it's monthly. I think at one point I'll get to the point where I can record all my episodes for a month in one day. And that era of podcasting for me, sometimes it's diving head first into something and getting really immersed, and then it needs to go sit on a shelf for a little while before I can come back to it. You know, like there's a season of gardening where I'm not in a garden, and it's called the winter. Like I'm not less of a gardener because I don't spend time daily in my garden. Like it's not even available for me to spend time in it in that season, and that's okay. You know, we're coming upon summer where I need to have flexibility. I don't need to. I want to have flexibility to spend time with my family, to go on vacation, I haven't shared this on the podcast yet, to love on my puppy. We just got a puppy. His name is Clyde. He's an English Mastiff. Go to my Instagram and check him out. He's awesome. But I want to build in that flexibility, and just because I don't show up to my business for a week or whatever doesn't mean I'm less of an entrepreneur. They say, that you should dress for the job that you want. Well, how can I use that metaphor to dress my mind for the job that I want? I always talk about how fear has a very full wardrobe. Sometimes it shows up as fear. Sometimes it shows up, it's wearing its imposter syndrome outfit of the day. Sometimes it's the shiny object outfit of the day. Sometimes it's a procrastination outfit of the day. Well, how can I dress my brain for the dream of what I want? Obviously, this isn't true. I have to make this, caveat. It's not true for everything. I'm not a lawyer just because I watched a lot of Law & Order SVU. One of my guilty pleasures is that I like to listen to the AITAH, I think, Am I the A-hole, TikToks where people write in. And there was this one where it was like, am I the a-hole because I got mad at my wife because she didn't call me a pilot when they went out to dinner with someone. He has like a simulator in his man cave and spends hours and hours on the flying simulator. So like the fact that his wife said he wasn't actually a pilot like made him so mad. Like, you don't have your pilot's license. So obviously this isn't true with everything, but I think it's true with entrepreneurship and a lot of these goals that we set for ourselves. If you want to be a runner and you run for 30 seconds and then walk for 30 seconds, like it doesn't make you less of a runner. One of the channels that I listen to frequently is Jessica Sowards, who runs Roots and Refuge podcast and YouTube channel. And one of her big sayings is turn your waiting room into a classroom. And I love that idea so much because I think when we long for things, and I think a lot of people who listen to my content are like the dreamers and the goal setters, and there can be a longing on your heart. Like for so long when I would go to like the Pilates studio or even when I worked in sales for the software company, it's like this longing to be able to do time and having that space to have the longing of your heart, but not lose the lessons that you can currently take from where you are right now is so important. She talks about in an instance of like, just because you have a balcony and you dream of owning acres and cows and horses and goats doesn't mean that you shouldn't spend time cultivating plants and learning lessons and having like small tomato plants. And what can you learn about just growing a handful of tomato plants and some pepper plants and going and visiting like a goat farm? And not looking at those that I'm not a gardener yet, or I'm not a farmer or homesteader yet because I don't have that. Like, what can you immerse yourself in right now so that when you do have that dream come to fruition, you're not 100% prepared. Like, you're still going to learn lessons even when you have those acres and those animals and those gardens. But you have picked up these small lessons along the way that makes you a little bit more prepared. So in that kind of same vein, like being a gardener isn't about what we produce, it's about the lessons we're taking away. And I think that that's similar with entrepreneurship. Like it's not about this factor of success of like, I'm doing it full time, I'm making six figures, I hired a team, I sell out every launch I have. It's about the lessons that we learn as we're in our Thomas Edison era. I say frequently I'm in my Thomas Edison era where I'm learning all the ways in which it's not working so that I can find the ways that it does. And because I have found ways that it doesn't work doesn't mean I'm less of an entrepreneur as I'm building the resiliency, the vulnerability, the fortitude, the consistency. Like that's what entrepreneurship is. It's those qualities. It's the ability to pivot. It's ability to keep working towards something. It's ability to put yourself out there, to hear no, to try and fail and do again and succeed and have your heart broken. And like, that's what entrepreneurship is. It's not about this, what society tells us is successful for an entrepreneur. So I think that if you feel called to call yourself an entrepreneur, that you should. I think that words are important and there's so much power in saying them before they truly feel real and true and hardwired into your being. It's not this like switch that flips. And so you have to wake up and say it to yourself every single day before you wake up and you just feel it. I hope this was helpful. I would love if you got something out of this podcast. Leave a rating. That would be amazing. But thank you so much for your time listening to the High Vibe Table Talks. Words are powerful. If you feel called to call yourself an entrepreneur, you are. And remember that big dreams and small steps will transform your life.
The greatest.